into those good stories. Look at other people who,
with no dependency on your feelings or on your thoughts or on the story or on the circumstances or on the history. Not that there wouldn't be an accompanying story. Yeah. Charles, St. George. Hi, Charles. Go ahead.
So my question is, if inquiry is a trick, as you called it, for presencing the matter being inquired about, how can you set up the inquiry so that, you kind of have a certainty that the matter of the inquiry will actually be produced?
Yeah, very good question. So I'm going to leap tall buildings with a single bound, which is always dangerous, and ask you to look into the listening behind your question and suggest to you that the listening behind your question.
So inquiry is the trick, as you called it. Yeah, very good question. So I'm going to leap tall buildings with a single bound, which is always dangerous, and ask you to look into the listening behind your question.
Is a request for certainty, as in a request for reducing the risk that a commitment to leadership is. That is to say that there's a certain color to the clearing of your question, and the color really, if we're going to be real, is not a reduction of uncertainty. Now, that's part of my response. The other part of my response is that a possibility which dies as a possibility is never realized, probably will be retained as an ideal. So what's probably happened is that as a matter of our culture, our ideals are all those possibilities for being human, which are now dead as possibilities and only live as ideals. And that really brings us to the role of vision in leadership and speaks to what we've discussed already about vision being in a distinct domain of its own, such that vision in leadership is the transformation of a possibility as an ideal to a possibility as a possibility. So what a leader does is to transform ideals into possibilities, or let's say return human beings, shifts it from the domain of an observer giving an account where it lives like an ideal, where it got by failing as a possibility, into the domain of the possibility of being for human beings. Suddenly, what was an ideal before now lives as a possibility of being for human beings. That's very different from what one ought to do. That's very different than a prescription. That's very different than an explanation. That's very different than even a delineation. We always think that the vision's got to be delineated. Maybe not. Maybe the real impact of leadership in the domain of vision is the transformation of an ideal, namely a failed possibility, to transform it by shifting its domain of being from the domain of an observer giving an account even from the domain of presence, like something human being, as the possibility of being for human beings is very different than the end of hunger as an ideal. A man on the moon as an ideal is very different than a man on the moon as a possibility of being for human beings. What we didn't get shaken out of the space program, the power that could have come from that, the knowledge that didn't come out of the space program, is that the space program became an ideal, got sold as an ideal, lived in the domain of ideal rather than living as the possibility of being for human beings. I mean, how could it? The possibility of being for human beings doesn't even exist in the world. That's not a distinction in the ontological space of being human. It is, by the way, the point to the forum. In case you might be wondering why we were doing the forum, why we're doing the forum is to create in the culture of being human the possibility of being for human beings, rather than merely the inherited opening or options for being, which being human is. So I say, as a practical matter, like a tip, that a possibility is fulfilled by promises and requests, and that, as a matter of fact, if you are looking at a leader, I say that what would be there like a presence is vision as a possibility of being for human beings, and unreasonable promises and requests as the opening for the fulfillment, or, Charles, to use your word, the realization of that vision, coupled, whereby compassion I mean a profound sense of what people will need to bring forth in themselves to make good on the unreasonable promises and requests. So, what I've just done is to establish, like a space of possibility, what leadership might be. And in the process, Charles, hopefully I've given you a tip about what keeps one's from dying as a vision instead of being realized. Anything more, Charles?
No, thank you very much, Warner.
Okay, thank you very much. Very good, very useful. So, in part, I'd like you to consider the possibility that leadership is a conversation. And I say that if you were a Martian and you dropped in on a leader, and you didn't have all this interpretation in the domain, if you were just present for what's there in the leader, what you'd be seeing is a conversation. That's what would be present. Speaking and listening and everything that goes along in a conversation with speaking and listening. By speaking and listening, I don't just mean what comes out of your mouth and what goes into your ears. For instance, if I ask Bill for some water, he doesn't walk up here and throw a bucket on me. Because in the speaking and listening of my request is a background of shared practices, but that shared practices live in the languaging. They don't live like objects of something that happened. Trying to tease out a more powerful teaching, which I often indicate by the phrase speaking and listening. So I want you to take the case that leadership is a conversation, but a very special kind of conversation. It's not the kind of conversations in which we're ordinarily engaged. Like, how was your weekend? That ain't leadership. How was your weekend? I like fill in the blank. I'm excited about fill in the blank. In order for this to happen, this has got to happen first. None of that is a conversation we call leadership. So the question is, what is the conversation we call leadership? If leadership is a conversation, and I'm going to ask you for the moment to stand in the case that leadership is a conversation. That when the Martian shows up, the guy from Mars shows up, and there's leadership, what he's going to see is people speaking and listening, a conversation. He's going to see languaging. He's not going to see courage. Even action is going to be languaging. It's not going to be action as action. It's going to be action as languaging, as a saying. So when the Martian shows up, all he's going to see is languaging. He's going to see a conversation. And what you and I need is a distinction in the domain of languaging that leadership is. That's the question. What is the distinction in the domain of languaging which leadership is? What is that special category of conversation which is leadership? What is that special listening which is leadership? What is that special speaking which is leadership? Yeah.
When someone is really actually leading, they are expecting or putting forth that there is more achievement ahead. You know, you can achieve something, but there's always more to go for.
Something maybe, Joy, like a context for what's being accomplished. So it's not only here's what there is to accomplish, but here's a context for what we're accomplishing. Okay, very good. Yeah, so I would say that one would want to inquire into the possibility that leadership was, in part, that special kind of conversation in which there's a speaking and a listening of a context for the objectives or goals or wherever we're going. Very good.
Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. Somebody else. Yeah, Susan?
Yeah, Werner. When I look at leadership, I know that it's almost like the word itself, leading. It's like you're out in front, and that when you're running out in front, or when you're taking whatever the project is you're working on and working on it and really moving with it, that almost in the wake of that movement comes others' participation, and they're following, and they're wanting to learn from you or wanting to work with you or whatever. Whereas when I stop and turn around and like orchestrate and I like direct or I manage, then it's like standing still, and it's not like being a leader.
Okay, again, you don't want to listen to what Susan's saying like the answer. You want a possibility into which to inquire. That leadership is a product of action. That the conversation is acting. And maybe Susan's suggesting that leaders don't act out of a strategy. You know, we all have a kind of strategy out of which we're acting. She's suggesting that leadership may be that special category of action which does not come from a strategy. It's not action based on strategy. Maybe she's suggesting that the strategy is based on action. Now, somewhere along the line, I think you've got to look into the possibility that a leader who acts into an opening and somehow is able to speak and listen to converse about that action in such a way that that action is an opening for others. See, it's one thing to step out on your own. That may not be leadership. It's another thing to step out on your own and have that stepping out live in a conversation which is an opening or a clearing for others to find their own stand in the matter, to be engaged. To lead, like sitting around figuring with your friends, may not be that special category of conversation which is leadership. See, you don't get heat out of a fireplace until you put the logs in. Most people want heat, and then they'll put in the logs. Listen, you can't sit around and think about leadership and expect anything to happen. You can't wait for leadership to show up, to be engaged in creating leadership. You've got to be willing to be engaged in creating leadership for leadership to show up. Susan is suggesting to step out, not just stepping out in action, but it's kind of like, to put it in very abstract terms, a stepping out in action for others, which in practical terms would be a stepping out in action which lives in a conversation such that your action is an opening to other people.
Exactly.
Very good.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Sam?
I spent last weekend with a group of writers, and we got some professional writers to come and speak to us about entering the field of writing music. And I noticed during the course of this weekend that there are moments when progress would just seem to stop. And then someone, and it was usually one of these professionals, would say some version of progress just stopped. And it doesn't need to stop, or declaring that it broke down. And but they would do it in a way that they'd say, "Oh, well, I can't." A lot of people would say, "This is really a hard struggle, to try to get it, a hard struggle." And they'd say, "Look, what you guys are saying is a hard struggle is what we do all day long. That's what being a professional is." And that you could sit there and listen to it as a struggle, or you could say, "Here's this whole other side of it, which is being successful." And so all week long, I've been noticing that when I felt like I had just been led, or all of a sudden when I would notice that here's this big opening, that something just opened for me, and then I'd say, I just got led at that moment, and it was from someone saying to me, you're up against this breakdown, on the other side of which is this opportunity. And they'd say it in such a way that I saw what the opportunity was.
Okay, so Sam, what I hear you saying is that the kind of conversation that distinguishes a conversation called leadership has something to do with a conversation about breakdowns, which engaged in the breakdown so much as something beyond the breakdown. I'm not saying this very powerfully because I don't want to get, I don't want to make a lot of conclusions about what you're saying. But that's what I kind of hear you saying.
Yes? Right. One guy said to me, he listened to this one piece of music I wrote, and he said, "This is a good piece of music, but it's not a great piece of music." But he said it to me in such a way like no one ever said that. He said it to me in such a way that I got to go home and start making distinctions about great music.
Oh, beautiful.
And it was just, but no one said it to me. I write well enough that I don't have anyone around to tell me I didn't write great.
Right.
And but this guy was qualified, and he was like, I have this whole area to go into now, of
I really love the way you said it that time, that in pointing out the deficiency and pointing out the missing, what was missing in Sam's music was greatness. But in pointing out what was missing, it was pointed out such that it was there for you like a possibility, not merely like something missing. So that may be a little bit of a clue here, to kind of take a look at maybe the conversation which leadership is a conversation about what's missing like an opening, what's missing like a possibility. Maybe what we were conversing about vision is a conversation about what's missing like a possibility. Worth looking into a little bit. Certainly, you and I are experts on what's missing. We know what's wrong with our family and friends and our coworkers, clearly. Now, could we have a conversation about what's missing in our family and friends and coworkers such that the conversation about what's missing showed up like a possibility for them. I don't know, but that would be worth some inquiry, it would seem to me. See, maybe vision isn't drawn out of the sky. Maybe vision is drawn out of what's missing, but rather than what's missing like a missing, what's missing like a possibility. Not bad. Really worth looking at. I don't know. But it's really worth looking into that this whole notion about vision as something created out of nothing is false. I think it's valid as a tool, and I personally am committed to continuing the inquiry into vision as created from nothing. But when I look at my own operation, I could authentically say I was leading. It's clear to me that it reflects exactly what Sam's sharing with us, and that is that I'm dealing with what's missing transformed into a possibility. That my speaking and listening, and you see, this is the critical part here for me. I know that one of the things that distinguishes me when I'm any good is that I'm listening for what's missing. And most people can't listen for what's missing. They can't listen to what's missing because it's invalidating and frightening, and they need the conversation and listening for what's good, because they need that evidence. So I've already accepted my badness, so I don't kind of need the evidence. Maybe, I don't know, but I do know for sure that I am listening for what's missing. When somebody presents something to me, I'm not looking. That's very strange because it flies in the face of all the good tips. See what you can find in there to praise. See what you can find in there to acknowledge. My listening is for what's missing. Somebody brings a piece of work to me. My listening is for what's missing. And my guess is that if I'm any good, if I'm of any value, I'm listening for what's missing like a possibility, not for what's missing like, too bad, nothing to do about that, that's missing. So I'm wondering if Sam hasn't begun to shed some light on this, what is leadership as a conversation? The conversation may be about what's missing as a possibility. Anything else, Sam?
No, that's it.
Not bad, Sam. All the way back there. Carl, we need to stretch our neck in that direction.
One of this conversation, being here today, got very clear that I started it way back in Israel a couple of years ago. While I was in the army, I flew over to pick Golda Meir to take her someplace to give a lecture.
Yes.
And I was very excited about the opportunity because I wanted to see this leader that I've read about. I wanted to be with Golda Meir. You know what?
Right.
And I flew in with this expectation to be with this leader. And she was at the time right after completing being a prime minister. And myself and another friend, we walk into the airport in Jerusalem, and she's there sitting. And I walked in I was looking for a leader.
Yeah, for the light.
For this leader.
Yeah.
And I saw what I was present to his grandmother. And I couldn't get over it for a long time. And then I had the opportunity to be with Shimon Peres, very close, and Menachem, began in a very intimate situation, which is different. I was always asking myself, what is the distinction? Like, what shows up when you're being with them? I never found something when you're right there with them. There was people, and there was no leaders for them.
Very good.
As a matter of fact, in one situation, I was the leader. I had to, an opportunity to interact with Begin in the place when his life was in danger, and I had to get him out of there. And I was telling him what to do. So I'm looking what's a phenomenon. And it's someplace in what Sam was talking about, that there's not only listening, but it's being with people like that. There's a humble about listening to people's requests in a different way. And we asked Golda Meir, we were in the same plane, so I asked her, tell me, God damn it, what's the trick? And, she was very humble, and she said that as a leader, the misunderstanding that people, where she's lack of power, when there's no power for her, is when people come to her to solve issues, like to come for an answer.
Yeah.
And all she wants as a prime minister is to get requests versus complaints.
Yeah.
And to have the kind of interaction that she can be useful, like you start speaking about, that so people to come to her with what's missing, conversation. So that's so I'm being with this kind of listening that is new for me. It's a listening to a request, but in such a way that what's left is people's action over there.
Yeah, very good. There's a distinction in there which I think we ought to tease out now and have as a part of this conversation. By the time we get around to saying leadership, whatever it was is all over. It's like in a home run. So a home run is when the ball goes over the fence, yes? So when a person says home run is when the ball goes over the fence. But by the time the ball goes over the fence, it's all over. In the same way, leadership is partly what Tal's telling us. By the time anybody gets around to saying leadership, it's all over. It's done. Finished. And Tal's saying that by the time we get around to calling it leadership, by the time we get around to noticing that it's leadership, it's all over where it actually happened. So maybe the distinction that leadership is in a conversation, in the world of conversation, is a conversation that initiates a conversation. So there is that conversation which we call leadership. What about this conversation that isn't the ball went over the fence? What about the conversation before anybody uses the word leadership? Okay, my suggestion is that you consider that leadership is that special conversation which initiates a self-sustaining conversation, which self-sustaining conversation will probably be called leadership. But I want you to have a realm of inquiries, not that realm in which we would use the word leadership, but another realm in which we probably wouldn't use the word leadership. See, like a guy standing in the batter's box, we don't call that a home run, do we? We don't call the guy swinging a home run. We don't call the way the ball shows up for the guy swinging the bat a home run. But maybe that's where the real home run is. Not out where the ball goes over the fence, by which time you can do nothing about it anyhow. So I'm inviting you into an inquiry into leadership as that special conversation which initiates a self-sustaining conversation, which self-sustaining conversation is going to get called leadership, but back there where nobody's going to say it, where there isn't any conversation about leadership, there's a conversation that initiates a conversation. So we take a look at Martin Luther King as an example of leadership. My guess is that what we call leadership was the ball going over the fence, and that the real leadership was exercised somewhere long before anybody wanted to use the term leader. What kind of a conversation might that be with your business associates, with your family, with your friends, with the people in your world? Could you open a possibility of being engaged in a conversation which was not ever going to be called leadership, but which would be a conversation that would initiate a self-sustaining conversation, which somebody might call leadership. See, by the time it was all happening with Martin Luther King, the leadership was all over, like what happened in the batter's box. It was now happening like going over the fence. So I want to give us an opening to be in a conversation with our colleagues and our friends and our family, such that we might be inquiring into the possibility of a conversation that initiates a self-sustaining conversation, one that other people are carrying on independent of you. Martin was not calling the shots. The civil rights movement was going on in people's actions and conversations all over the country. And maybe he had a conversation that initiated that self-sustaining conversation. See, and those kind of conversations are not had by leaders at that point. They're only, as Kyle's pointing out, people, grandmothers. So thank you very much. Elliot?
Yeah, that in looking at leadership, I started trying to sort out what was the difference between a leader and a visionary.
Very good.
That the leader gets up and says X, and the visionary gets up and says X. And yet the visionary gets up and says X, and nothing happens.
Yeah, it's kind of satisfied with having said X.
Yeah, and the leader gets up and says X, and something happens.
Very good. If you're listening for what's missing, and now you got it as what's missing, what is the conversation which transforms what's missing from what's missing into a possibility? What's the conversation that takes what's missing and transforms it into a possibility?
Simply, it's a declaration that in a situation I've been involved in a negotiation with, actually a project that came from the last Saturday series, that seemed to be very hopeless. This discussion has been going on. There's been one side with the leaders, one side have a set of positions, and the leader of the other side have a set of positions, which are my bosses. And nothing has been going on. Periodically, they'll get together or they'll write to each other, but nothing happens. And I went out this time and I looked and I was sort of hanging out with the homework. And I said, well, gee, I'm just going to assert that we have a window of opportunity to settle this thing. And I said that to one side and they looked and they said, we do? Gee, let's talk. And I called, what are they saying? I said, well, I don't know what they're saying. Here's what I think might happen here. But I just kept asserting things.
Okay, so I want to just change one word in there. What I heard you say was that a what's missing, like a description of what's missing, is different than a what's missing like the declaration of a possibility.
Okay, but what I had seen in looking at this thing was simply that there was no conversation that anything was possible. All the conversation was there was no possibility in just positions.
Yeah. So, an assertion is kind of a commitment for what you're asserting. Let's just say for the moment, when we want to distinguish various kinds of actions in speech, that there's one kind of action in speech called an assertion, where that action is a commitment that you've got evidence for what you're saying, as contrasted with a declaration, which is not a commitment you've got evidence for what you're saying, but merely a stand for something. So never mind how you said it to them, but you were a stand for the possibility of getting the thing settled. And what that was a declaration that expressed in the words as a window of opportunity here.
Exactly. And I had been looking for something that wasn't jargon, or at least was jargon that they could hear. And I just flat said, we have a window of opportunity. But I had, in the last seminar, we talked about you can say what you want, but you don't get to be arbitrary.
Right?
that it was real clear to me that I didn't just get to be arbitrary about that. I had to almost listen for the echo.
Very good. So look, it's kind of interesting that we get where we're going inevitably always. That's great, Dwight. Thank you very much. This is a question which I've got fairly clearly formulated without any inkling of its resolution. But it's something like this. If you take creating, bringing forth, visioning, declaring a possibility, you need to recognize that it's going to meet with something that for the moment we'll call reality. I'm going to change that later. But for the moment we'll call it reality. So, Newton didn't create the possibility of a man on the moon because technology wasn't there. So yeah, it's true that when Kennedy made the declaration that it was a declaration, but it had to be met with a certain reality. So my way of wanting to say that to you, the way I do say it to you is that leaders create, possibility they create is not random, arbitrary, or capricious. You can't create any old possibility. So to kind of beg the question and not really get into it, you can say, oh, well, leaders create authentic possibilities. But I want to get into it with you. At least I want to get into it like a question. Because I have the sense that until you've confronted this in a fairly powerful way, you're always going to have a sense of yourself as pretty limited. As in, you're always going to be frustrated. Look, it can't necessarily be the way you envision it. And that may not be invalidating. Because in fact, your vision someplace needs to meet reality. And your vision needs to accommodate reality in some way. So, in fact, if you stand on one side of that issue, you say, my visions are limited by reality. If you stand on the other side of that, you say, reality is limited by my vision. But neither sense of any validity by itself. So, look, I want to get us out of this silly kind of fanaticism that says you can do anything you can envision, because you can't. And the opposite is not true, that it's only possible to do what that our visioning has.
Hello. Hi. Hi, honey. Hello?
Hi. We're on our way home. Can we do lunch, please? Because I have to go to Little Mermaid after this and then go straight back to comedy.
Yep.
Okay, great. Is there any big nuggets left over?
Yeah, it'll just take me 40 minutes.
Okay.
I would have to make them. They're not left over.
Okay, so you don't have them left over.
No,
That's okay.
no.
What are other options we have?
Steak burger, turkey burger.
Henry, would you like a turkey burger? No? Okay. You need to eat something if you're
Chicken
coming with me
nuggets.
later.
I have chicken nuggets.
Can you fucking answer the questions? Well, you do. Okay. Okay, so let's answer for mommy right
salami.
now. Can I have the kind of hamburger with some pickles? And do you have any leftover macaroni with garlic and oil or something?
I can make that pretty quickly.
Okay, cool.
Okay, I hear it.
Macaroni with garlic butter.
I hear you.
And okay, what about a little, like, could Daddy chop up a hamburger and put it in there like it's like a meatballs? Okay, chicken on the side for Henry.
Okay, no problem.
Does that work?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right, talk to you later.
See you in a sec. Bye.
Bye.
To be shaped by reality. Now, the one thing about which you can be certain, whatever is accomplished will be accomplished in reality, or it won't be accomplished. Because that's what we mean by accomplished, is something that happens in reality. So if you are a commitment for something now not allowed by reality, you better wake up and recognize that when it's accomplished, either reality will have changed or what we mean by reality will be reinterpreted. See, gravity was not possible. And Newton's commitment to gravity required a reinterpretation of reality. Ending smallpox was not allowed, was not real, was not allowed by reality. In this case, we didn't need a reinterpretation of reality. We needed an alteration in what was real. In Newton's case, the interpretation of reality. What does reality mean? So I want us to start to get hard here. Like tough, hard. Tough in the sense that bamboo's tough. Not tough in the sense of rigid. But to see that that for which we stand, those realities to which we're committed that aren't already predictable and inevitable, are going to be realized in reality, and you better be shepherding your commitment such that it can be realized in what we call reality. Not out of that should you take it that we're limited to what reality says is possible. Nor should you be the fanatic who says that anything is possible, because in authentic visions, what I've called the commitment and what I've called reality have to meet. Now, here's the new distinction I want to invite you to. I want to invite you to a distinction called design. D-E-S-I-G-N. Design. And what I'd like you to be inquiring into is, what is this distinction called the design of the world, to which my commitments must be faithful in order to be authentic? See, if you take all of the buildings in the world, they don't tell you what's possible as a building. But in the practice of design, up comes what's possible in buildings, not predicated on all the buildings that have ever been designed. One more shot at that. We're all kind of clear, we think we're clear at least, that being an artist requires a certain freedom. You can't produce art by following the numbers. You can't produce art by following a set of rules. No one will produce any real art by following the rules of producing real art. No one will ever produce any real art by understanding thoroughly what constitutes real art. That real art needs some freedom in its exercise in order to produce real art. We're all convinced of that. What we often don't realize, that mere freedom will not produce art. See, I can go up there and slap paint all over the canvas, and that doesn't make it art. What freedom may be is not a lack of constraint, but a dancing with the design. And that's what I mean by design. See, nobody can say what art is. We can say what art was. By taking all of the examples of art we've ever had and putting them all into a room, we can say that was art. But you can't say what art will be tomorrow, even if you've got all the examples of art. Because there's something brought forth from nothing, a bringing forth from nothing, which art is. Yet that bringing forth from nothing shows up in something. And I'm suggesting to you the distinction, like a new distinction, called not reality or the circumstances. I don't think there's any power in that one, but I'm recommending a distinction called design. And that what makes a commitment ring like a vision rather than a good idea or a position, somehow you can hear that it fits the design. It's never been done before. It's impossible under the circumstances, but it's somehow consistent with, like in a dance with the design. Now, I give you all of that in no way as information. What is unsaid by virtue of what I'm saying is where the opportunity to think for yourself lives. Don't think what I just said. What I said is brutally incomplete, but it does open up something that you can engage in by thinking for yourself, not if you think what I said, but if you'll stand on what I said and give thought in Heidegger's sense of thinking for yourself to the issue.
Leadership from Ideals to Possibilities was produced by Michael Portis for Werner Erhard and Associates. Copyright Werner Erhard, 1986.
Okay, we're on the best ever. Peace and love. Bye, bye.